Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast.
Organisations that have been engaged in this work for a while tend to be pretty good at it. I've been involved in a number of startups over the last few years, and there are things that you can do that help. Regardless of what the therapeutic or the theoretical framework you use is, it's good to have a therapeutic or theoretical framework. It's good to have terms of reference that everybody can agree upon. The thing that works really well is a basic framework of this is how we work, and some clarity about what are we here to do, and above all, a space to think and reflect. The idea that we pause in the work regularly and we think about what's going on for the children and what's going on for us and what's going on in the space between. What might staff starting this work need to know, and what might foster care need to know? The thing that I would say is the thing that you're striving for is understanding. If you're an RCW, residential care worker, and you started in the work last week, a good place to start is, well, what would give me a better understanding of one of these children? The act of admission is a massive intervention. If you know the stories of the children, it will affect how you are with them. But actually, I think there's a huge value in structure and boundaries and routines and rituals. The care plan and the running of the home should be quite boring, because the children, because it should be so predictable. If you want to establish a children's home and you want it to be beyond the ordinary, there needs to be a lot of focus on, okay, what are our rituals and routines, and how do we deliver those consistently, and how do we get to understand our children better? My definition of therapeutic is it's the conscious use of relationships to deliver transformation. But I think sometimes you need to be reminded, and you're custodians of childhood, so part of your job is to give these children a childhood that they will remember fondly. If the thing that has led you to being where you are is a failure of parenting, the solution should be some kind of parenting. Everything we do has the potential to be something that child makes use of later. As an adult, I think children have a sense of people trying, even when they're getting it wrong.
Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pearce, and rejoining me this episode is highly regarded social care consultant in the UK, Tom Ellison. Now, before we begin our conversation, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I come to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So as I said, I've got Tom Ellison rejoining me for this episode, and Tom previously was on the podcast for episode 27. So if you want to hear me read out his bio, we're streamlining it a bit this time, but his bio is there. It will be in the notes for this show, and it was episode 27. Welcome, Tom. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back, because I did feel at the end of the last podcast interview that we kind of only got the conversation half done in a way.
Yeah, well, I think there was a big focus on leadership, and I know you wanted to come back and talk about the work with children and what effective residential childcare might look like.
Yeah.
So happy to be back.
Well, that's probably an excellent spot to start in terms of, I'm interested to hear your views, and I'm sure our listeners and watchers will be too, about what effective, what quality residential care looks like. And is there any distinction between quality and effective? I'm not really sure, but happy to hear your views.
Yeah, I think there's a big invitation to jump into talking about attachment and trauma and therapeutic frameworks, etc. But I think there's a few things that you just can't help noticing when you've been around the work for a while. So one is um, organizations that have been engaged in this work for a while tend to be pretty good at it.
Mm,
So I saw your interview with John Turberville and Kevin Gallagher, who each come from, their organizations have been around a while, certainly
mm,
decades. And there is something about organizations doing this work accumulate knowledge over time. And one of the phrases I've used is it kind of gets into the wallpaper. So it's
mm,
not so much about, yeah, there are individuals you could point to and say, okay, that person's been around a while. That's a wise head. We could go and ask them an opinion on an issue. But there is something to be said for the culture that develops over time. And that's partly shaped by the theoretical framework, the consultants, the people leading those organizations. It's also
mm,
shaped by the children. So
mm,
organizations respond to what the challenges that the children bring through the door. And a good organization or a good children's home is responsive to the children, not just in terms of what the children tell you they need or they want, but what the children show you they need and they want. And so, one of the, again, if I'm visiting a service, a children's home or an establishment, I'll quite often ask the manager, how long have you been here? And
mm,
you can draw conclusions from that. That there are few substitutes for experience and time travel. That said, there are things I've been involved in a number of startups over the last few years, and there are things that you can do that help, and so um, regardless of what the therapeutic or the theoretical framework you use it's good to have a therapeutic or
mm,
theoretical framework. It's good to have terms of reference that everybody can agree upon. And, there's various, if you sort of wander around and do a tour of the UK, there are various, and there are various kind of levels as well. So, for example, in the last few years, there's a training called PACE training,
mm,
which is, it's kind of a training in how to be around children, involving things like being curious and being empathetic and things that are just a good idea if you're going to be around children who've experienced trauma. But I would treat that as that's almost universal now. It's almost a standard training for anybody working in residential. But then there are layers beyond that, and
mm,
and quite often one of the phrases I've used is there's levels to this game. There are, and certainly in my career, it's almost like layers of understanding as you travel. It
mm,
becomes deeper and deeper and deeper, and the danger is that you hear about that there's so many theoretical frameworks and models that you can choose from that you end up overloading the staff because a senior manager comes across PACE training or social pedagogy or pillars of parenting or secure base, and they think, oh well, I'll bring that one in, and then they'll
mm,
bring another one in, and then they'll bring another one in, and then before long, the staff at the coal face are a little bit overwhelmed, and they're
mm,
mixing up their metaphors, and a lot of jargon's getting deployed. And you'll know from the last podcast, I'm not particularly a fan of jargon. But I think the thing that works really well is a basic framework of this is how we
mm,
work, and some clarity about what are we here to do,
mm,
and above all, a space to think and reflect. So
mm,
whether that's um, individually with staff in supervision, or whether that's in moreover, whether that's in a group setting, and that gets called different things depending on the organization. It might be reflective practice in one, it might be called dynamics in another. But the idea that we pause in the work regularly, and we think about what's going on for the children and what's going on for us and what's going on in the space between. And so when I've been helping, as I have been recently, organizations to establish new services, they're the kind of the reference points that I go to. The first one being what's it for? What is this service, children's home? What is it for? What's it to do? What's the problem that it solves? And then build out from there. But universally, if you work, in terms of working with looked after children, universally there's some level of trauma and attachment there. It might be variable in how it manifests, but it's there. And so therefore I would always kind of build in the idea of, well, there needs to be reflective spaces. And there needs to be somewhere where the staff can reflect on and think about the experiences of the children. And again, going back to, the organizations that you would say, oh, they're pretty good at this stuff. That's where they've iteratively done that over decades. The thing that's allowed that culture to develop so that they've got good at doing the work is that there is an iterative process of things happening between the staff and the children, and then the staff having a space where they can think about it and process it and develop a greater understanding of what's going on for the children.
I talk about this a bit in my own work, that one of the things that if you work for a long time, and if an organization has existed for a long time, serving a community, then you have the opportunity to reflect back on not just immediate or short-term impacts of the work that you do, but longer-term impacts of the work that you do as well. So you build up a bank of knowledge really about what works and doesn't work, and what long-term outcomes, medium to long-term outcomes look like for the people that we're serving, just based on being around for a long time and trying different things and seeing how those things work or don't work. And I know, for example, you mentioned the mulberry bush, that they have, with Richard Rowlandson and others, they have become quite proactive in terms of reconnecting with alumni of the mulberry bush. Adults now, parents, husbands and wives, who came through that system and they're still getting this. They're getting longer term feedback about the experience of young people as they've gone through the mulberry bush, which can only really add to that important practice wisdom that develops over time.
Yeah, I think that someone said to me, if I look at residential care in the UK as a whole, there are fewer, I'm going to say controversial things now, but there are fewer specialist providers than there used to be. If I think 15, 20 years ago, there were a number of providers, usually operated by their founder, who were doing innovative and creative things, some that you might agree with, some that you might find a bit more controversial, but they were all trying to pioneer working with children who've experienced trauma and who were in the looked after children system. I think increasingly I think something's happened over the last 15 years where there are fewer of those organizations than there used to be. I think that it creates a space because it creates an opportunity for other people to jump in who've got ideas. But I think that someone said to me a couple of years ago, we've forgotten how to do this work. And he's not talking about individual establishment. He's talking about as a sector, the knowledge, the reservoir of knowledge in the sector is less than it used to be. And I kind of agree with that, the thinking that gets deployed in some organizations is not as great as it should be.
Mm.
And so where organizations are, um, as I know some of the organizations you've been in contact with are gathering and preserving knowledge about this work,
Yeah.
that becomes important because because where do you go to learn to be good at this work? Because
Mm.
an awful lot of practice has been distilled into short courses, and
Mm.
we'll deliver a short course, and you can go off and do therapeutic work with children without an understanding of actually it's an ongoing process. You never actually get there. You never when you got in touch and said, well, let's do another one where we talk about the children. I always feel a bit I'm much more nervous talking about the practice with the children than I would be about talking about leadership,
Mm.
because I feel like with the children, you never actually get there. You're just you're constantly trying to get closer to something that's helpful.
Mm.
And so one of the things that, you know, in terms of experience, one of the things that I went through is as I got more knowledgeable in this work over decades, I felt guilt that I wasn't good enough in the beginning. I look
Mm.
back to the children that I worked with in the first, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 years in residential practice. And the more sophisticated me can look back and go, yeah, that wasn't
Mm.
good enough. That wasn't great. Or you weren't connecting, you weren't being still enough, you weren't understanding what that child was trying to communicate to you. And so that experience for me is the idea of, well, you never actually get there. There
Mm.
is no, you don't arrive. You don't get to, I am now, you know, maximum proficiency at working with, children who've had negative experiences of
Mm.
uh, early childhood. You don't get there. You try and get closer to it.
There's a couple of things that you said in there and in your earlier response that I'd pick up on and love to talk more about. I love the idea of building a reservoir of knowledge, a reservoir of knowledge. I think that that's gets to what you were saying and what I was taking from what you were saying in my previous reflection. Um, I agree that I think what comes from experience is the understanding that there are I call them enduring sensitivities. There are enduring sensitivities that the children carry from their experiences growing up, and including their adverse experiences that they take with them through life. And um, that makes sense because we all consider that we are in some way shaped as a person by the experiences that we had growing up, as well as our contemporary experiences. Um, and I think it's really important to know to have a really good target in a sense, or a realistic goal for the work that you're doing. Otherwise you can become you can feel inadequate. You can become despondent. You can feel um, like you just haven't done enough for the children. And without hogging the floor too much, I see this a lot with in foster care, where foster carers are brought into the system, both with the ideas that they come with and with ideas that exist within child protection and out-of-home care systems, that all the children need is a loving home, yeah, a bedroom and a loving home, and all will be put right. And I don't. That's just not the case. It is manifestly not the case, and it is highly problematic in my view to for these advertising campaigns to exist and these recruitment campaigns saying that you will, if you have a spare room and a lot of love to give, you will experience this fulfillment of being able to turn around the life of a young person. Now you may well do that. You and Often enough, lives do get turned around, but you don't erase what's happened in the past. Sorry, there is always an enduring sensitivity. So I think we just need to be really mindful of what is possible, lest we become overwhelmed, despondent. And I think that is the case right through the social care sector. And you hinted a little bit at primary tasks, and we did spend a lot of time talking about primary tasks last time, but I think it's really important to start somewhere. And starting with having an understanding of what you're actually here for. What is your role? What is the role of the organisation? What is my role in this organisation? Where do I sit? I think is a really good place to start. But it does make me think when you look back, and I have done the same, and you think, oh, I wish I knew back then what I know now. And of course, it's not possible to know. Unless it is part of the reason I set up this podcast was to kind of speak to people with tremendous experience and have a reservoir of knowledge. I might pinch that, a reservoir of knowledge that people who are embarking or are early in their career journey can dip into and for their learning and understanding of the work. But I'm wondering if there's particular advice that you would give relatively inexperienced workers in the social care sector about how to approach the work.
Yeah. Just before I do that, I want to respond to the because it occurred to me even as I was saying it that, oh, that's what you're doing. You're the reservoir of knowledge thing. You're capturing it on video and on audio and making it accessible. So, and in terms of the last podcast, all kinds of people have fed back to me that they listen to that. Not necessarily people in our line of work even, but I think in creating conversations about the work with people who have some experience to share,
Mm.
I think is incredibly valuable. In terms of, and I was interested in your point about foster carers as well, and saying, well, do you have a spare bedroom and do you have some love to give? Maybe you could help a child, and it's not a bad beginning. It's not a bad beginning. I think where that goes wrong a little bit is there is a little lack of understanding of the primary task and the challenges that these children are likely to bring. Because there's a sort of fostering crisis in the UK, in that the pool of foster carers is getting smaller over time, and there's many reasons for that. And the government at the moment is putting a lot of resource into advertising campaigns for foster carers. I'm not sure whether that's going to lead to a sustained increase in the number of foster carers, because I think there is a problem about how foster care is described and what it is. What is it that we are asking these people to do? Because yes, we're asking them to provide a home and we're asking them to provide love, but there also needs to be an understanding. Well, first of all, needs to be an understanding of what these children might bring through the door with them,
Mm.
and an understanding of, well, what do they actually need? Because and if I link into what does staff starting in the work, what might staff starting in this work need to know, and what might foster care need to know? The thing that I would say is the thing that you're striving for is understanding, so that
Mm.
not just children, human beings rarely have instances of being fully understood by another human being. Yeah, when it happens, it's usually fleeting. There are people in your life that you'll think, oh, well, that person gets me. And
Mm.
so there's some understanding there. But those moments of deep understanding and connection are rare. And I think that in therapy, in relationship-based therapies, one of the things you're aiming for is that not just that the therapist understands the client, but that the client has an experience of being understood.
Mm-hmm.
So that two-way thing, and it's a connection. So I think for, and I think I talked in the last podcast about the idea of, I do come across people who think the job is to make children behave. And I think that's, and in circumstances where a child is in a foster placement or a residential placement and they do well and their behavior improves, that's a good thing. It's not bad. But I don't think that's what the work is. I think the work is about um, allowing children to have an experience of being understood by an adult and that a relationship grows. Because I say obviously, it follows that if you have a repeated experience of being with somebody who you feel understands you, you will develop a relationship with them. A relationship will blossom from that. That is helpful. So in terms of if you're an RCW, residential care worker, and you started in the work last week, a good place to start is, well, what would give me a better understanding of one of these children? It's easier to start with one. You're not going to, if you're working with, a number of children, it's easier to pick one, and maybe you'll be directed to one by the management, but it's easy to just pick one and say, okay, I'm going to go on a little mission to develop a greater understanding of that child there. And that can be done. Certainly in my early career, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on it. I think I've worked in environments where an understanding of the child's history was significant enough that there were dedicated professionals in the organization that went out and found it. And because I don't know how it is in Australia, but one of the issues anybody who's worked in residential for a short while in the UK will tell you is that the paperwork is never accurate. And that's not the local authority's fault. It's just that, gathering information on a lifetime of experience is not an easy thing to condense into a short biography in a social work report. So one of the things that I would invite that new RCW to do is to turn themselves into a detective and try and find out that child's story. And yeah, a good place to start would be the paperwork that the child arrives with, but I wouldn't restrict it to that. I would get curious about who are the people that this child has been around, whether they've been carers or teachers or social workers, or who can I speak to who knows this child, and try and gather a deeper understanding of this child and their history, because that will play out in the relationship with the child. Your deeper understanding. I'll give you an example. A thing that happened. So some years ago, I was managing teams of children's homes, and we had an office that the teams came to fortnightly for team meetings and to do some reflection. And one of the managers asked me to come into the meeting because the team were in open rebellion. So I went into the meeting and was confronted by some really angry residential care workers, and they directed that anger at me as I came in through. There was a real kind of bombarded with indignation. And the reason they were angry is one of the children they were working with was pretty much on a daily basis being very violent and hurting people. And once we got through the anger and the frustration, and the conversation shifted to me being curious and saying, well, tell me what's happening. Tell me the story. And they were describing a boy who was about 12, something like that at the time. And what they were describing was actually, in the morning, he was lovely. He went to school. The feedback from school was the teachers said he was delightful, very quiet. He'd get home in the evening. He was fine until around dinner time. So 5:30 in the evening. And then he became more agitated, aroused, and that played out. He would be quite manic and giggling and grinning. And I remember someone saying he looks like the devil. They said when he's got this devilish look on his face. And he'd start to push things off the dinner table and run around the house. And this escalated through the evening until, you know, 9, 10 o'clock at night, windows are being broken and people are being hurt. And it would go on till the early hours of the morning. And just by asking questions, we gradually got a picture of a child who's in the day's baseline was relatively steady and low. And then there was this sort of gradual escalation in the evening till around 8, 9 in the evening. And then usually what they were describing was he wanted to come out of it, but he didn't know how. So he wanted to kind of get back to normal, but he didn't know how. And it took a few hours to get him back to normal. And he had a dedicated life story worker, and there was a life story worker in the room, and the life story worker noticed that the peak of the acting out was 8:30 at night, when in that home, it was all boys. In that home, the boys were having baths and showers. Coming in from evening activities, they'd been doing sport or something like that, and they were having baths and showers. Then they'd have supper and, a wind down to bedtime. And she kind of jumped on this and homed in on it a little bit and said, "Oh, that's significant." And no one in the room really understood why it was significant. Okay, why is that significant? And she said, "Well, when he was 5, he lived with a foster carer, and whenever he wet the bed, the foster carer ran a cold bath and held him underwater." And there was I get emotional when I tell this story, but there was a hush, and somebody started to cry. And then the meeting ended because it had taken that long to get to that conversation that the school runs. People had to go off and do school runs. So the meeting came to an end. And normally when we were dealing with something like that, we'd start planning. We'd say, okay, so what could we do differently? How could we plan? But there was no time for it. And I didn't hear any more about this. And I went to the next meeting 2 weeks later. I thought, right, I'm going to go in and see what's going on. And I went to the meeting, everything was fine. No one was discussing this boy. They were discussing other things. They were discussing the rota and the paperwork and who's not filling in the paperwork properly and the things that get talked about in those meetings. And I was really curious. I said, well, what's going on with this boy? And they said, oh, it's fine. It's fine. And I said, well, what's going on around bath times and stuff? And they described, they said, oh, he's having baths. And they described, like, they'd done some things. They decided that they were going to put a member of staff outside the bathroom on a chair so there was someone close, and they bought him some bath toys and bubble bath, and they'd made bath time softer, nurturing, But I don't think it's what they did that made the difference. Yeah, it made some difference, but I think the big shift was they understood.
Their understanding. Yeah.
They understood. And that wasn't in the paperwork that came, because he'd had a pretty, awful set of experiences throughout childhood. That detail wasn't there. And so we only knew that detail because the social worker, the life story worker, who was a social worker, had gone out and done the digging and uncovered these stories. And so that team didn't need a deep understanding of any therapeutic model. They didn't need to understand neurology or have studied, the effects of trauma on the development of the brain. They just needed to hear that story. And once they heard that story, it made sense.
It's powerful.
And then everything just fell into place. And so that was a real powerful lesson in, if you know the stories of the children, it will affect how you are with them, how you relate to them, how you respond to agitation as bath and shower time approaches, in his case. But there's probably a version of that for every child. And understanding the story really thoroughly informs in a way that allows understanding to take place. Because without that understanding, certainly the anger that I walked into, they thought he was just gratuitously hurting people,
Mm, mm,
and as much as they were a really empathetic team, if you're day after day after day dealing with a child who's trying to hurt you, it does,
bear on you.
resentment can,
Mm,
feelings of resentment can get into you,
mm,
so I think that one, um, do your best to understand the children you're working with.
yeah. And just if I can jump in there, while you were telling that story, I was thinking he's been hurt. That's when he's been hurt. And I didn't go to what had happened maybe in a foster placement, but I was thinking about, um, maybe he in his history, there had been an adult that returned to the home at around, after after normal work hours, and that something adverse was happening to him at that time.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're talking about is um, it's about working beyond the need and the behavior to understanding that the children are not just needs and behaviors. They have a mind. And I talk about this in my podcast interview with Peter Blake, which is already released. But how I think he was saying that people don't always see that children have a mind, a thinking mind, or an experiencing mind, and that um, these experiences they go somewhere, and it's important to be curious about, well, where do they go? How are they stored, and how do they present later on? And Peter and I were talking about, this goes right back to the very early days of a child's life. Um, if we understand that they have a mind, that they're not just needs and behaviors, then we have to have an understanding that, well, where does all these experiences and their processing of these experiences go? How is it held, and how does it then manifest in the way they approach life and relationships thereafter?
I think because I feel like when I came into this work, I was blundering around in the dark, and some one of the other things in terms of useful things is that when I came into this work, people talked about structure and routines and boundaries all the time. Anybody you met in residential, and consistency, words like consistency, but consistency, structure, routines, boundaries. And that's less fashionable to talk about now. It's much more fashionable to talk about trauma-informed practice.
Mm,
But actually, I think there's a huge value in
yeah.
structure and boundaries and routines and rituals. And like
Hmm.
people didn't really talk about rituals, but I remember working in a children's home that had a very distinct ritual around Sunday mornings, and it was lovely, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed joining in. Okay,
Mm,
we've got this
mm,
ritual. They've got the pattern of the week, but Sundays are a bit different. This is the ritual on a Sunday, and
mm.
the rhythm of the day to day is extraordinarily helpful. And again, I think that it can be underestimated. People reach for, they want to talk about trauma informed work or ACEs or therapeutic
Styles
jargon
of
words
care. Yeah.
to embellish thek work, to say, okay, my work's sophisticated. Whereas
Mm,
actually, I'd say, well, look, really understanding the children helps. A clear structure with routines and boundaries and consistency. One of the things that I often said to people working with children who are new to the home is actually, to some extent, the care plan and the running of the home should be quite boring because the children, because it should be so predictable,
mm,
because the children are bringing such a high state of anxiety that that's what they need.
Absolutely.
They're accustomed to um, mealtime shifting, bedtime shifting, who's looking after me shifting. Am I going to bed at this time? Am I going to bed at that time? What time am I going to school? Am I going to school? So they're
Mm.
used to that lack of consistency. So one of the biggest gifts we can give is, okay, here's some consistency and predictability.
Now you know
And
what will happen.
that daily ritual and routine is enormously
Mm.
helpful. And but
Mm.
people don't talk about that anymore. They'll talk about, the need to be empathetic and curious, and those things are useful.
Mm.
But I think the basics tend to get overlooked a little bit. And if you're working in a really sophisticated service, that's fine because it's just part of the culture and the ritual routines will
Mm.
look after themselves. If you're establishing, if you want to establish a children's home and you want it to be beyond the ordinary, there needs to be a lot of focus on, okay, what are our rituals and routines? And how do we deliver those consistently? And how do we get to understand our children better? Before you start layering on, okay, well, let's bring in a specialist
Mm.
consultant to do, to explore the unconscious processes that might be
Mm.
going on between the staff and the children. That stuff's important, but actually,
Mm.
um, without setting the stage by saying, well, actually, we've got consistency, we've got routines, we've got boundaries, the roles are clearly understood between, we know what the manager does, what the deputy manager does, what the senior workers or team leaders do, what the RCWs do. We're really clear
Mm.
about that stuff. And we've got this routine that in a way, we try to grind out. It will never go like that because the children will bring in, they will disrupt that routine and that's where the work lies actually. Then disrupting the routine is an opportunity for some work to take place.
Mm.
But I think um, it's interesting. I've been involved in the establishment of some new services in the last year, and it's interesting where I found my mind going. And yes, we did introduce um, reflective spaces and consultancy. But actually, there was quite a bit of focus on what are the rituals, what are the routines,
Mm.
what are we putting in the environment, how are we using the environment to create something that is warm and nurturing and homely.
And some would
Uh,
say that's what PACE is. I mean, PACE is about a therapeutic, establishing a therapeutic environment or milieu. Um, I'm with you. I just think that you have to start with consistency of routines, of rituals, of care. And everything that you set out to do, you should be able to set out to do it consistently. And if you can't do it consistently, or there can't be consistency managed between staff members, then you need to pare it back a bit or find something that they can do. I think I think consistency comes second to connection. It certainly in the work that I do, what I've taught in terms of importance. So connection, absolutely over the length and breadth of the service that we're providing is the most important thing. But I think consistency runs a close second. And part of that is, while I was listening to you, I was thinking about, where the children come from chaos or bad things have happened unpredictably. And part of and talking about that the case example that you gave a little bit earlier, it was important to develop a ritual and routine, I think, for that young person to have to know what was going on and to have an alternative experience of that. But I don't think the care that what we're doing in this aspect of the work is that sophisticated. As you say, it's relatively boring, and if people don't know it in this way, I would have them, and when I talk, I have them think about, well, how do we raise little babies? Yeah, because I think that's often enough where things started to go wrong for the children that we come across, that they didn't have those experiences of predictability of routines around nurturance and care, that a child who grows up in a comparatively stable, loving, responsive home had. And so, I think there's a lot of similarity between how we set out to manage our home for the children we're talking about, whether that be a children's home um, or a foster home, a kinship home. A lot of what we're seeing comes from deficiencies in how they were cared for in the past. And if you think about, well, how do we set a new pattern? How do we reset? Well, that we go back and we redo some of that in a more age appropriate way, perhaps in some respects, but we reinstitute or we institute the kind of consistency that you see when you're raising infants. While you're pausing there, the other thing I wanted to pick up on something else you just said, which was um, get to know the children. And I think that my mind goes to a number of directions, I guess, on that. But so there's two. Actually, it's one. People will sometimes say, well, we don't get enough information in this sector. A common complaint is from people who are in a care role with the children and young people, is that they haven't got all the information. It hasn't been shared with them, so it's very difficult for them to know, the details of the history. Now, while you were telling that story, my head would, because I've worked in the sector for 30 years, my head immediately goes to something bad has happened at that time. And I don't necessarily need to know that it was in that foster care placement. My mind went to an adult comes home and something bad happens at that time. Um, I didn't need to know the intricacies of that, or the finer points of that history to know that we've got to change the child's experience of this time. And as you say, we've got to acknowledge that this is likely because he has had some adverse experiences around this time. So, as you say, it just changes the way in which people approach the
I
relationship.
think it's more than that. I think it because it changes the way people feel.
Mm.
So it's not just it. So yes, of course, knowing that information might change the care plan. Might change the way you approach those tasks. But I think the greater bit is it changes the way you feel as a
Mm.
worker. So the resentment and anger that was being experienced based on the child's behavior evaporated
Mm.
as soon as people understood, oh, that's what's going on.
Mm.
And like I say, one person cried, but the thing, there was a real shift in the emotion in the room.
Yeah.
And so, I can understand how someone being hurt by a child would develop feelings of resentment.
Hmm.
And that evaporated once the staff understood why that
Yeah.
was happening. And
Yeah.
that then changed the way they, so it wasn't, I don't think it was about, I don't think what happened after that meeting is they got together at another time and had a real powwow about how they're going to handle bath times. I think just the
Mm.
way their emotional response to his agitation
So,
was enough. I think that was enough. And yeah, and then over the 2 weeks they developed. They shifted the ritual around bath time to make it more tolerable thing. But I
mm,
think the big thing that happened was a shift in how they felt.
mm,
Um,
absolutely.
and that's the sort of thing, that's the sort of thing that makes reflective spaces necessary. So that stuff can be processed and you can get in touch with, okay, I feel like this right now.
Mm.
Uh, I feel, resentful and annoyed with this 12-year-old. That you can find your way to um, what what happened to the infant that led to this 12-year-old that's
Mm.
smashing the
Mm.
house to pieces. Going back to the thing you said about going back to very early childhood. I had a conversation in the last week with someone about when children are admitted to children's homes, and I kind of it's going out of fashion now, but there was a fashion of if you were coming at it from a children's rights perspective, well, when a child joins a children's home, they should spend time with each of the staff. We'll see who they get along with, and they can choose their own key worker. Yeah, and that was pretty widespread. I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that. And I always felt that missed a big opportunity, and the big opportunity is that the act of admission is a massive intervention. Like the biggest thing a children's home can do for a child is admit them. Because you're taking them from one situation and you're bringing them into another. Well, you're taking them from one world and you're bringing them into another world. And when, and I use this metaphor, when a woman is pregnant with a child, everybody talks to her about what's going to happen when the baby gets here. You know, someone might help create a nursery and they might have a baby shower, and there'll be lots of conversation about motherhood, what motherhood's going to be like, and you know, ideas like, you know, are you going to have the baby in your bedroom? When you're going to move in the nursery? All these kind of conversations go on and set up the minds. What that does is it prepares everybody for the idea of there's going to be a child and there's going to be a mother. And I think a version of that can happen even for a teenager when a teenager moves into a children's home, that the home can do that preparatory work, the conversations about who's going to be the key worker, how we're going to welcome the child into the home, how we're going to bridge them in. Because I think what works really well is when there is an individual who bridges the child into the home and becomes their gateway to the relationships in the home, and a process called claiming, where you literally go out and claim the child. You're coming with me, I'm going to look after you. And I think it works particularly well if that person is the key worker. So the key worker goes out into the world, meets the child, brings them into this new world, and then becomes their kind of parent. It's not quite a parent, but it's not far off. You know, they become their kind of parent and the link to the other relationships. Because where you don't do that, and I did some work with the team where they didn't agree with that, and they thought, no, we let the child come in and choose. And I said, well, what do you think on the first night in the home when the door closes? What do you think the child's thinking about? And they'd say, oh, well, they're scared and they're anxious. And I said, I think they're probably trying to remember everybody's names because they've been introduced to half a dozen people or a dozen people, and they're trying to work out who of this lot is actually gonna keep me alive, and potentially who's the threatening one. And so that, you know, in the world of, because I think what we're doing in this conversation is we're making building blocks, and we're saying, okay, well, structure and boundary and routines in the primary task. What are we here for? Are we clear about it? Have we got a structure? How do we set the scene? What are the structure and routines? And all that stuff gets worked out before you. I've done it recently. All that stuff gets worked out before you ever admit a child. There's lots of there should be lots of conversations about what our structure, boundaries, and routines are, and then moving up a level. That, okay, how do children come into the home? Well, it should be a process of being claimed. They should feel like somebody went into their world and claimed them and brought them into this new world where, you know, the promise is you're going to be surrounded by a bunch of thoughtful adults who are going to nurture and care for you.
Just quickly, it just puts me in mind of one of the key themes that comes out of research with alumni of children's residential care is that feeling of belonging somewhere, and to someone. And Jenna, who's Jenna B, whose last name I'm struggling with at the moment, but yeah, Jenna, she talked about the research that she did with her in her PhD thesis highlighted exactly what you're talking about, is that the care leavers who'd been through residential care really appreciated the fact that they belonged somewhere, the experience of belonging somewhere and to someone.
Well, all of these things contribute to belonging, because I think belonging is one of the things that you would want to achieve. So the and they're all things that accelerate relationship.
Mm,
Because I mean, I quite often, in a residential placement might not last that long.
mm,
And by not long, 2 years is not long in a lifetime.
mhm,
And so these are things that accelerate the development of relationships. So um, if a team, if you were starting from scratch and you really thought about what you were there for in your primary task, and you spent some time thinking about structures and routines, and you developed a philosophy about, well, we really want to understand our children, and we're going to have key workers, and the key workers are going to have particular relationships with the children that would be more parental than the other relationships in the home. And the key workers are going to go out into the world and claim these children and bring them in. And then we're going to use our structure and routines and our rituals and our understanding of the child. All of these things contribute to a sense of belonging. That
mm,
eventually will, 6 months on, maybe a bit longer, but the child has a sense of, okay, I know where I am here. I know the structure and routines and rituals. I know the people. I know that they know me. I know that they can tolerate the things that I do and say. And all of that stuff, it's not a straight line formula, but all of that stuff contributes to a greater sense of belonging. And and then it also creates the space where you can do some work
yeah.
that could be broadly described as therapeutic. Because I think that stuff's just good practice. I wouldn't say, oh, that's, that I think it's good practice, but it creates the space and the relationships and the safety to do some therapeutic work and to you consciously use relationships to give rise to transformation, which is that my definition of therapeutic is it's the conscious use of relationships
Mm.
to deliver transformation.
I I hear what you're saying, and I hear and I acknowledge that it is good practice, to set up these very fundamental building blocks. But I do wonder whether identifying with them as good practice diminishes their importance a little bit. And my reason for saying that is that there can be an inordinate focus on the therapeutic intervention as the change agent. But the therapeutic intervention, and Patrick Tomlinson and I talk about this, and we talked about it as recently as only a few days ago. You can't a therapeutic intervention won't is unlikely to be successful if it's done if the we haven't taken care of the environment first, that we haven't created an environment around the young people in which this therapeutic intervention can make a difference. So the reality is a therapeutic intervention may have no impact at all if the environment is not set up appropriately to facilitate that. But the environment will always be therapeutic if done according, or if established according to the principles that we've been talking about. So yeah, it's good practice. But I wonder about whether the just good practice diminishes the importance of it. I think it's vital.
I think you might be right. I've struggled over, I don't know, the last decade with the therapeutic as applied to children's homes. Not because I think it's been misused a
Yeah.
lot, and I think it turned into a marketing term. And um, the I have in my own mind a notion of what the threshold is for a therapeutic service, and I was repeatedly being introduced to services that were described as therapeutic, and I just didn't think they were. It didn't mean they were
Mm.
terrible. I don't think they were bad. I just don't think. I think, as I said earlier, there's levels to this game,
Yeah.
and it was a colleague of mine challenged me recently about this and said, "Well, you know, um, if we're creating therapeutic services, we should call them therapeutic services." And I think she had a point, because I think it is
Mm.
my own hang up, because I got quite uh, resistant to using the word therapeutic, because not because, you know, for someone who's kind of spent his career at that part of children's residential care, I think it was because I felt it was being misused. And
Mm.
so I kind of stepped away from it a bit. But you're right to notice, actually, what I'm describing is, how do you set the stage such that, relationship-based transformation can take
Yeah.
place? And that claiming process, I would say, there's so much about a placement can be set up in the way the admission takes place. You,
Mm.
you can you can um, cover a lot of ground in the admission process. And I think people underestimate what it means for the child to move from one world on Tuesday to another world on Wednesday.
Mm.
And I'm loosely in touch with some people who were kids. They're not kids now. They were children when I worked with them. They're in the 40s
Mm.
now. But they can each tell me in absolute clarity about the day
Mm.
they moved into it was a service that I was working in. But they can tell me with clarity about, 30 odd years later, 35 years later, they can tell me with absolute clarity about what happened that day,
Mhm.
because it's a very significant intervention.
Yeah.
And like I say, I think the there is a lot of work that can be done in that admission process that sets the tone for uh, a greater chance of a successful experience in a children's home,
Yeah.
or in a therapeutic service. Um,
I think if I can jump in there, I just think that it is good practice to be reflective about our use of the term therapeutic and even our application of principles of therapeutic practice. I'm mindful Simon Benjamin was on the podcast within the first 10. I can't remember. I think it might have been podcast number 8. Simon's a social care consultant here in Australia, but he's worked for a number of organisations. He was the CEO of the Lighthouse Foundation, and he worked at the Mulberry Bush School as well. And Simon talks about therapeutic from understanding where that term comes from, and he talks about it coming from the medical profession or medical science, and that therapy, the idea of what is therapeutic is not just um, you have a set of principles or practices that you just apply. Yeah. In medicine, therapeutic is the dose at which what you apply makes a difference. So where that then the crossover with that is that in our work there's probably a lot, if not most services are applying therapeutic principles, therapeutic ideas and therapeutic techniques. But are they getting the dose right? That's the lesson of what Simon's saying, is that from medicine is that it's only therapeutic in the right dose. And different children require different doses. Yeah, for that therapeutic effect. So that all that by way of it is a bit. It's not as simple as just setting implementing a set of principles, a set of ideas, and a set of practices. They have to be in the right dose, and that's part of the nuance of this work. It's part of the complexity of it and the complexity of our children. I think it's aided by what you were saying earlier about getting to know individual children
I
well
think, I think, and knowing what you're there for.
and knowing what you're
So,
there
so,
for.
so you're getting to know the children in service of developing a greater understanding that is in service of those children experiencing connection and belonging.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that as a younger man, I was very intense and very, kind of looked at the work as kind of wanted to be good at the work. But you have to remind yourself sometimes, and you're custodians of childhoods.
Mm,
In as much as there's work that needs to be done, and there is work that needs to be done, and there's lots of, the depending on the nature of the service, there can quite often be external pressures on what work are you doing. There's regular meetings to ask what work are you doing and what progress is being made, and can you show me your outcomes? But I think sometimes you need to be reminded, and you're custodians of childhood. So part of your job is to give these children a childhood that
mhm.
that they will remember fondly. And so
It's such an important role.
finding opportunities to have fun and enjoyment along the way are quite important.
Mm,
And the thing, so for some people in the work that comes quite natural to them. They'll just go and have fun with the kids. And for others, you need a reminder. Actually, this child is um, not a project. Then, yeah, it's all well and good that you're being an amateur psychologist trying to help this child recover from their trauma, but sometimes they need a day off to just go and have some fun.
yeah. More than one day, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. You said, I'm coming back to something that you said earlier, which is fundamentally, I would refer to it in these terms, that the experience of being heard and understood and acknowledged in your experience, and of being understood not just in the words, but in the actions and in the outward presentation and expressed emotion of an adult, of another person, I think is probably our most powerful
Mm.
intervention. I don't know of a more powerful one. I often say there are things that you can't change for young people. Like, it's the law that they have to go to school as much as they hate it, as much as we are unhappy with how the school are managing them. But you can still empathize deeply with, you can still acknowledge with deep understanding the child's experience of the fact that they have to go to school and they don't like it. Yeah. Like sometimes the only thing we can do is acknowledge the child's experience with deep understanding. And I think that that's our most powerful intervention. And why I think it's the most powerful intervention, which you've hinted at, or you've mentioned as we've been going along, has to do with the child's experience, that the child's experience of being heard and acknowledged, validated in their experience, is that my experience is real. I am a person of worth. I am this person cares about me. This person understands me. I can trust this person. I can trust this space around me a little bit more and more over time. What a relief. What a relief that I'm now somewhere with someone or some people who get me.
On the journey, because I was thinking back to, okay, building up in layers from what are we here for? What's our structure and routines? How do we bring children into this? What's the nature of the relationships we're aiming to have? Because the thing I think understanding is very important, but I also think that the nature of the relationships, it might not be quite the same in a therapeutic community at times, but I'll restrict myself to children's homes. But in children's homes, the nature of the relationship is a parental relationship.
Mm.
And again, I think there are, particularly if you're working with teenagers will invite you not to be their parent.
Mm-hmm.
They will, they
Friend
will
zone,
invite
yeah,
you
if
to
anything.
be some kind of friend or,
Mm.
something else. And I think again, in the world of, well, what actually works is to assume the position of a parent. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think one of the reasons I would put forward is the idea of, well, if children are in care, it's because in some way, shape, or form they've experienced a failure of parenting.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, if the thing that has led you to being where you are is a failure of parenting, the solution should be some kind of parenting. Now, it's not, to your point about foster care and have you got a spare bedroom and love to give, the inference there is that all these kids need is a parent figure. But actually, over time, you find that, well, no, they need a bit more than that.
Mm.
They need something beyond ordinary parenting. So, and sometimes it's called therapeutic parenting, but ordinary parenting won't work for these kids because ordinary parenting doesn't factor in the effects of trauma and the effects of neglect on development. So, if not ordinary parenting, then something like extraordinary parenting. So something that is parental, but that goes beyond regular parenting, where there's, the thing that would now be called trauma informed, but an understanding of actually these experiences in early childhood affect the development of the child's brain to the extent there are things that they can and can't do, and that might change at different times. So we go back to the example I gave earlier of the 12-year-old. He could function like a regular 12-year-old most of the time, but then when he was stressed by the routines in the home, um, he could not cope with that, and that led to aggressive acting out and people getting hurt.
Mm.
And so understanding that's partially about the way his brain's developed. That's partially about his ability to or inability to problem solve and articulate himself, and that that I don't want to get too neurological, but there are different brain states there are different brain states that are exaggerated by adverse early childhood experiences.
Mm.
And so that's the additional knowledge you would need to be an extraordinary parent, but you're still a parent.
Mm.
And so that the parent bits should still crop up in there. And then that starts getting complicated because parents hold authority, and parents, going back to the beginning where we said, okay, you're going to need structure, routine, and boundary. Well, the boundary bit can be a bit complicated with our children because they push against boundaries and test boundaries. And they're testing about whether you're a safe adult or not
Mm-hmm.
some of the time.
Whether
And
you look after me.
yeah, yeah. And so, and how will you respond? How if I do this, and you can almost see sometimes, I can remember, when I worked directly with children, you'd almost see them like they test thresholds. What are you going to do if I stand here? What are you going to, what if I pick this up and drop it? What are you going to do? And then looking, okay, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do now? What are you going to do now? But I think the complicated bit for residential workers is you hold authority, but as a residential worker, it's hard to work out how much authority do you hold and how can you express that authority safely
Mm.
in the interests of the child. Yeah. And that's, about if um if one member of staff says no to something, will the other members of staff hold that same line? Will the management hold that line? Will other stakeholders from outside the system step in and say that's not a reasonable line to hold? Whether it's things like in the modern world, things like mobile phones, really
Mm.
good. So, what are the thresholds around mobile phones?
Mm.
What age can you have a mobile phone? If you've got a mobile phone, should you have it all the time? Should you be able to take your mobile phone to bed with you? Should you, and to be fair, that's something that, regular parents battle with. But in a children's home, it gets really complicated because you go, okay, that's a boundary, it's got a threshold, and people may differ on what they think that threshold is. And that can be sorted out with a meeting and a discussion, and you can agree a threshold, but then people will vary on their ability to hold that threshold.
Mm.
And that's where it starts to get really complicated. And I think that's uh, people are not fond about talking about that stuff. It's much easier to talk about curiosity and empathy and playfulness and uh, things like that. It's much harder to talk about. Sometimes we need to say no to the children because
Mm.
that's what good parents do.
Mm.
And that's where it starts getting complicated. And that's been particularly complicated in the UK over the last certainly since 2014.
Mm.
So in 2014, there was a case, there was a court case I'm sitting in Cheshire, it was in Cheshire West. And um, it was actually about an adult. It wasn't about a child, but it was an adult in a caring situation. And the question that the court was addressing was, are these adults, carers, depriving this person of their liberty by saying you can't go out whenever you want to, and by supervising them? And I think there was a 2-to-1 supervision ratio or something like that. But this
Mm.
person was heavily supervised, and there were restrictions on where they could come and go. And the court found that that was a breach of Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Mm.
And the fallout of that, and that gradually, it wasn't an overnight thing, but that's gradually found its way into children's services. And there's been various cases over the last, since 2014, like 10 years. And so increasingly, what you'll see, particularly in referral paperwork, is referrals of children's and it will say they have a doll. And a doll is a deprivation of liberty order issued by a court. And that's where the court decides what the boundary is. And so the court will decide. It can be about things like mobile phones. It can be things about supervision. It can be about whether what to do if this child attempts to abscond. And that's a well-intentioned. The court made a well-intentioned decision, and whenever deprivation of liberty orders are produced, they're well-intentioned because their intention is to protect the rights of in our case, a child in care. The problem with it is it's caused a lot of muddles around who has authority.
Mm.
So if you and when local authorities are in doubt about what a threshold should be, they'll apply for a doll. If they're not sure, they'll apply.
Mm.
And so since 2014, there's been a gradual increase year on year in the number of dolls. And it's kind of crept down for younger and younger children. So there are dolls, being issued for children under 12.
Mm.
And so the difficulty with that is it essentially says that a judge and a court decide the boundaries
Mm.
or some of the boundaries that are issued in a children's home.
Mm.
And I think that makes it really complicated for the staff. I
Mm.
think one of the other things, an unintended consequence of that ruling, is it's made residential childcare much more expensive, because
Mm.
where there is a deprivation of liberty order, it's a court order, and the local authority has to be assured that whoever's providing that care will adhere to the order because it's a court order. So you can't say, well, we tried, but it didn't work out. And so what that's led to is higher and higher levels of supervision of
Mm.
children and an increase in the number of solo placements. And solo placements, just by their nature, tend to be more expensive. So it's put a real strain
On
on
the
local
system.
authorities,
Mm.
and it's kind of shaping I don't want to overstate it, but to some extent, it's shaping the market. That, and it's certainly shaping um, the confidence with which residential staff can take up that parental
Well,
role and issue a parental boundary um, about whether a child, what should happen if a child walks out of the door, for example. And you might have different responses. You could look at, okay, what do we do if this child runs away? And there's lots of different things you could do. If you could go with them, for
mm.
example. But there's even an argument that, well, if you're going with them and you're constantly supervising, that in of itself, even if you're not preventing them from leaving or bringing them back, the fact that you are going with them is in itself a deprivation of liberty. So you end up with, I think it's created, like I say, I think it's well intentioned and it's there to protect children's rights, but there are unintended consequences. The unintended consequence is the authority of the staff who are in the day-to-day parental role is undermined,
Diminished.
and there is confusion in the system about what can you do and what can't you do, and a notion that's relatively new of, well, we'll need a court to decide that, which again, certainly when I was working directly with the children, there were children on, there were care orders, and there was different kinds of care orders, but certainly in if I thought a child was going to run out of the building and put themselves at risk, I didn't give too much thought to what are the legal consequences of me saying, I'm not going to let you do that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sounds like the subject of another podcast, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert on this stuff. This is it's
We'll make you one.
yeah, I'm sure there'll be people listening to the podcast that say, oh, he's not quite right about that. Or
Mm.
but it's certainly, and I'm making a connection between local authorities requesting. It almost seems universal that when there's a doll, they will immediately interpret that, and this child needs a 2-to-1 solo, which I don't think needs to be the case. I've been responsible for, not in the non too distant past, for a 6-bedded service that had more than one child in it who was on a doll, and it was fine. We just worked through it. But I think what it's doing is it over time, these things nudge
Yeah.
practices, and
Creep.
practices get nudged towards, if there's a deprivation of liberty, it's probably going to be a 2-to-1 solo placement that we're looking for. And
Mm.
that trend, um, that trend has increased. There's certainly a place for 2-to-1 solo placements, but I would regard them as an intervention in order to allow something else to happen later, rather than an end in themselves.
Well, like I said, we could probably talk a lot more about using the parental role, I guess, and understanding the important aspects of the parental role that it's important to operationalize in children's homes and therapeutic communities. You were using the word enhanced. I think I use enriched. Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's the richness of it that you can adjust from child to child with the dose that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Um, but before I let you go, because you need to go because you've got a busy day tomorrow and early start, um, I I just wondered what you thinking about the children. What do you think we would like for the children to say as graduates, as alumni, as adults, say about the experience that they had in a children's home, in a children's residential care home?
I think you'd want them to say they felt loved and cared for. You know, I think that love's another difficult word in residential. There's a resurgence in the UK of people using the word love within practice.
Mm,
But you know, going back to that, a sense of belonging. You know that they feel or felt that they belonged. They didn't
mm,
feel that they were guests or placements. They didn't feel like a placement. They felt like, no, this is a place where I belong and where I'm connected. And
it was,
you know, I've heard different. Someone wrote to me a few years ago, wrote me a really long letter about someone I worked with really early on in my career, and I thought he'd had really positive experience. He had nothing bad to say about it at all. Now, whereas my reflection on it was, well, it was in the old days where actually staff ratios were really low, and you know, I think it was one of those situations where I was looking back and thinking we could have been way more sophisticated there.
mm,
Yeah, he'd written to me saying, you know, he thought this was transformational and it set him up for life, and like really got a lot from being there and the relationships. And he was, you know, and he was sharing memories. He was yeah, there was a game show on TV that we used to watch together, and it turned into we'd have like a little competition between us about answering the questions in the game show, and that was one of the memories. I'd kind of forgotten about that, but he talked at length about this experience of watching this game show and how fun it was, and we kept it like we had an informal scoring system,
mm,
and so it's that, you know, I'm reminiscing on his reminiscence and smiling. And I think, you know, you'd want that. You'd want, yeah, I've felt belong. You know, and I've had other children talk about reflecting on when they were difficult to look after and appreciating that the staff stuck with them
mm,
through difficulty. Um, so I think it's different for different children.
mm,
But his recollection was, it made me smile because he was reminding me of things that were not that significant to me.
mm,
We did that thing, I don't know, for however long that quiz show ran for. We had this little game on a Wednesday night where we'd all sit and watch this quiz show together and keep score and joke about who'd answered the most questions and so on. And
mm.
it didn't mean a lot to me at the time. I didn't see it as particularly significant, but then, you know, 25 years later, he writes to me, and that's his one of the bits that he presents and says, look, this was really good fun and I've thought about it a lot.
I think there's a message in that, Tom, that for people who are just starting out in their practice in children's homes, in being a care worker for our children and young people, is that not to underestimate. Yes, years bring experience and knowledge and sophistication, but don't underestimate the little things that you can bring to the life of a young person. Um, Notwithstanding that you're an early career practitioner in this space.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things, you know, we could have a long conversation about when placements break down. But you know, I worked in a situation. I'm going back a long time now, where a placement didn't last long at all. It lasted like days, and then broke down. That home, the location, and various things about the actual setup didn't work. And and I was a manager at the time, and I remember the staff feeling like they'd failed. And the thing that I kind of reminded them of is you can't judge that. You can't judge that now, because everything we do has the potential to be something that child makes use of later as an adult. That they might think back to a moment in time, like the quiz game. But I'm thinking about in more where it's rockier, where it's much more, much less fun. There is always, you can't judge what that child will think is relevant in 5 or 10 years' time when they look back, and I think there's a value to. Our kids have a really good way of making us confused and lost. And quite often what we're doing is we're struggling to find a way through. And I think that struggle in of itself is worth something. I think children have a sense of people trying, even when they're getting it wrong.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. That was again a really thought-provoking and enjoyable conversation. And I better let you wind up your day, because as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I know that you've got a busy one tomorrow. So thanks again, and we might have to do round 3 at some stage.
My pleasure. Thank you.